Before you buy a game on Steam, even the ones you've been anticipating, you likely first look through some reviews. And I mean individual player reviews, not just the recent and all-time scores or even third-party reviews from IGN. If I see multiple people with hundreds of hours in a game leaving positive reviews, in my experience, it's likely going to be a great game. Seeing that others have managed to get that many hours out of it makes the decision to buy any title much easier, while at the same time, if I see people leaving negative reviews with hundreds or thousands of hours in the game, and they've added hundreds more hours since, you just aren't going to convince me that you didn't get your money's worth out of this $12 game. And before you take to the comments, I do understand it's a recommendation system. Someone can enjoy a game while still not recommending others to play it. But 500 to 600 hours in a single player game? There's a threshold for hours invested, which when crossed, just becomes the review itself. And I'm sure you've seen them. Reviews that simply say, "It's alright," or something similar. That doesn't work if left by someone with 1 hour of playtime, but several thousand, say less. When you see reviews like this, you know the game has replay value, even more so when those types of reviews are common. Replay value is a factor to take into consideration when purchasing any game, especially now that we are entering the era of $70 titles. Not every game needs to have an infinite amount of replayability, or any at all for that matter, but it is comforting to know before we purchase first if we're getting our purse's worth, bars. Replay value is the reason why Skyrim, a game that came out in 2011 and has not seen any DLC since 2012, has 3 times as many daily peak players on Steam than Metaphor ReFantazio, a game that won 2024 Best Narrative and Best Art Direction, as well as being nominated for Game of the Year. But why? Why is it that we choose to play games that we've played for hundreds or thousands of hours over the dozens of games that we've been wanting to play over the years that have been piling up in our libraries or wish lists? I've had Metaphor on my wish list for a few months since before it was even released, and despite it going on sale at least 3 times, I still haven't bought it. I own 3 Persona games on Steam, but have only played them for a combined total of 5 hours, and I love those games. Yet when Path of Exile 2 came out, I managed to put in more hours on release day alone and continue to play it now. Just what makes some games so replayable and appealing to us? After looking at my own library and others, I found that the factors which contribute to a game's replay value and long-term appeal can generally be placed into one of 5 categories. Throughout the video, I'll be giving examples of games with high replay value as they relate to each grouping. The first of which being content. Obvious, I know, but let's get it out of the way. It's the reason why Fortnite has added half a dozen new game modes over the years, why hero shooters continue to add new champions to their rosters, and why MMOs add new areas and bosses. Content. If you bought the next From Software game to find out that there are only 3 bosses, you'd refund it immediately. The content of a game is the foundation that gives players something to experience, and depending on how that content is set up, can compound on itself, leading to an exponential increase in ways to experience the game. Take Path of Exile 1 for example, perhaps the only game I know of that you can argue suffers from having too much content. It has so much content that some have taken to giving lectures on various mechanics which would take more time to watch than you could play most AAA games today. But thanks to the nearly unlimited ways in which you can build a character and the dozens of mechanics you can interact with, it allows for builds which would normally have no place in the game. If you want to focus on single target boss killing, you can do that. If you want to focus on filling your screen with enough projectiles and effects that your $3,000 gaming PC taps out, you can do that too. Just as important as existing content is having a steady stream of new content, whether that be by way of regular updates or paid DLC. Even a game as open and endless as Minecraft gets regular updates to this day. New content is the easiest way to get old players to return to the game, supporting the community and drawing new players in at the same time. We even saw Elden Ring's DLC get nominated for Game of the Year, as crazy as that sounds. Apparently even DLC is being regarded on the same level as fully fledged games now. The amount of value you get out of well-maintained games versus one-time story games is just night and day. I love games with a good story, but if that's the only selling point, I'd rather watch someone else play, rather than going through the potential chore of doing it myself. But even games that aren't being actively developed can still have an influx of new content if there is a large enough community around it. Skyrim being the biggest example of this. The number of mods available for Skyrim, even though it's not official content, provides players with a value proposition that is hard to beat. If developers give their communities the tools and opportunity to mod their game, it could lead to DLC-sized mods that absolutely put some game developers to shame. And speaking of community, none of us can exist without others, unless you somehow materialized into being one day all on your own, more power to you. But for the rest of us, our brains are wired to interact with each other, and having some form of social interaction makes any game much more appealing and dynamic. In the modern day, where nearly everything is online, adding in some functionality to interact with others is often the lowest hanging fruit that can go a long way to keeping people invested in the game. This is why I think so many of us look back fondly on our first MMO. For a lot of people, that was the first time we got to interact and cooperate with so many different people. It's no wonder so many chase that nostalgia only to find disappointment. The reason those games were so fun is partly because it was your first time working together with a community or guild to accomplish some shared goal, whether it was cooperatively raiding a dungeon or participating in large-scale PvP. Simulated social interactions can often be just as effective as the real thing and has a similar effect on the replayability of a title. Games like RimWorld and The Sims come to mind. Both these games introduce elements of drama, romance, and unpredictability using simulated personalities within NPCs. When it comes down to it, for better or worse, people are just plain unpredictable, and adding unpredictability to any experience is going to give it some replay value. Games like Persona 3, whose social system was innovative 20 years ago when it released on the PlayStation 2, are much more rigid in structure and don't allow for the same level of unpredictability. In the same way that we are wired to interact and cooperate with each other, we are just as or even more so driven by competition. Competitive games like Counter-Strike or League of Legends are not set up to be fun in a vacuum. Any enjoyment from such games is dependent on how well you compete with others. Imagine playing your favorite competitive game, but you play with and against the same bots every time. How long would you play such a game? My guess is not very long. These games only work so far as they allow and have players to compete against others. Take the players away, and the game too disappears. Competition is one of the greatest motivators through all of society, and to that end, going hand in hand with both content of and competition in games is the ability to develop and express one's skill. Long-term goals and aspirations surrounding any medium would make people more willing to stick to it, especially if they can perceive their growth as they play. To that end, having a high skill ceiling seems to be one of the most important factors to the replayability and appeal of any game. Skill ceiling being the upper end of what is possible with perfect play. Think Faker from League of Legends. Even decade-old games like Rocket League remain still appealing due to its maintained skill ceiling, bars, where you start flopping around like a fish out of water and can gradually build to making your car ballet through the sky as you score at will from anywhere on the field. But the initial difficulty of controlling your car can be a serious turnoff for many, which is why having an accessible skill floor or minimal skill needed to effectively play can be just as important for a game to build up a player base in the first place. Skill expression is not limited to just the technical ability to make your avatar do what you want it to. Knowledge is just as important. In the case of non- or indirectly competitive games, knowledge of the game and its mechanics is critical. Path of Exile's racing system is a great example, where knowing which quests to do and all the nuanced crafting recipes plays a major factor in who can rank on the ladder. Any game that people speedrun would benefit from similar understanding of the game. For competitive games, even the greatest player would lose to someone much less skilled if they are caught in enough of a disadvantaged position or matchup. You can be the greatest technical player of all time, but if you don't know the game, it won't do much to help you. Even if you are playing a game like OS, which may appear to be mostly reaction-based, having knowledge and experience with a map is a huge advantage to performance. Top players will play the same map dozens if not hundreds of times, chasing after the top ranking. No matter if the game is a direct competition or a solo experience, proper balance of all the ways one can express skill is mandatory. Games like Monster Hunter World, which strike a pretty good balance in the effectiveness of all of their various weapon types, make it so all options seem viable. If the balance was notably off, players would gravitate towards the better options. Why work harder to do what is easily done by another weapon choice? Imbalance leads to an indirect limiting of choices available to the player, forcing them into playing more viable options. Having a wide range of options available to the player goes a long way in ensuring both replay value and appeal. Whether it is heroes in Valorant or weapons in Elden Ring, player choice is a factor that scales and varies all other content in a game. Having a variety of choices in how you interact with the game exponentially increases the appeal and number of experiences one can have with the game. Warframe is one such game that gives the player so much choice that you're bound to find something that suits your playstyle. From frames and characters to guns and melee weapons, having so many different choices in how you can play Warframe made it very hard for me to even try out its most recent competitor, The Last Descendant, as the gunplay and character abilities in the game at the time just didn't appeal to me. Even something as simple as having multiple endings and questline options in a single-player game makes the whole experience much more interesting. Alternate outcomes based on player decisions have been a staple in gaming since at least the Dungeons & Dragons inspired titles of the 1990s, and for good reason. It makes the game seem much more dynamic and alive. The concept has been so effective that developers will go out of their way to give an illusion of choice, even when the outcome is effectively the same. The ability to let players create their own story to an extent allows for much more diversity of experience in ways that the developers cannot predict. Games that implement ideas in the realm of choose your own adventure have arguably the highest replay value of all. Sandbox games, like Bannerlord and Kenshi, are a great example, as every playthrough will happen differently and depends entirely on unprompted choices you make to interact with the world. The feeling that the world is reacting to you builds curiosity on how the world may have changed with a different set of choices and actions. These open-ended role-playing games, where you are given minimal information to the player character, allows players to mold them however they like, compared to traditional RPGs that stick you into the shoes of a pre-written protagonist, just doesn't have as broad of an appeal. The gameplay loop. Arguably the most important factor that determines a game's long-term appeal and replay value. Fun gameplay that rewards the player for playing, investing their time, energy, and mental focus is a must for the longevity of any game. Games that pull this off successfully keep you engaged and coming back without making it feel like you are wasting your time. This is why chess has had such a large resurgence in recent years. Chess has always been competitive with all the hallmarks of any other competitive game, but it was missing that critical gamification to give people the incentive to continue playing. When Chess.com started gaining traction in 2020, it gave players that missing gamified feedback in the form of an ELO rating system, which is just a comparative representation of player skill. That and adding many time formats and ladders associated with them have worked wonders for the world of chess. For a gameplay loop to feel good, it needs to give positive feedback for effort invested. Typically, this will manifest in many avenues for improvement, either skill-based or RPG-esque character account building. Tale of Immortal is a great example of meaningful and incremental rewards. As you play through the game, you improve your character with a plethora of passive and active skill slots, which you find randomly generated as you play the game. You also improve your character stats in a multitude of other ways, and then multiply everything by the dozen or so tiers of difficulty you progress through as you advance further in the game. These kinds of looping gameplay setups prevent feelings of stagnation and continually give positive feedback for time invested. Being able to see yourself make progress in anything makes us more likely to stick with it long term. Games that do this poorly end up not giving a proper amount of feedback relative to the time invested, usually in the form of excessively low drop rates for items gated behind repetitive tasks. And to make things worse, they often offer shortcuts in the form of microtransactions to circumvent the unrewarding grinding process. At the end of the day, replay value is dependent on if the game is fun enough for the player to play it beyond a single playthrough, and all the categories previously listed are different vectors a game can apply to increase the enjoyment a player can have within it. In fairness, not all games have to be replayable. Some of my best gaming experiences came from some of the shortest and most unassuming titles. I still vividly remember scenes from Fury and Azure's Wrath. These kinds of one-off titles, while they don't take long to get through, have been more impactful for me than games I've put close to 100 hours in. You never know what will spark inspiration or just click with you. I've learned through my experiences playing video games that you must respect your own time, as game developers certainly will not. Especially so with the modern day advent of live service games proliferating the industry, forcing a false replayability into the experience. They deliberately create the issue of low drop rates or level-gated content to force players to waste time on boring activities or to buy the solution from an in-game shop. Rather than create an enjoyable experience, many game companies now focus resources on the creation of a framework to siphon cash from their players. Today, buying a game and never playing it is far from the worst outcome. The opportunity cost of wasting your time can often be much more expensive than any game's price tag. We play games to play, and highly replayable games may simply promise more in the way of play than other games may. What the fuck am I doing? American psychologist Charles Schoffer, the father of play therapy, once said, "We are never more fully alive, more completely ourselves, or more deeply engrossed in anything than when we are at play." When replayability is forced by way of chore-like repetition, we cease to be in that state of play. Should we be lucky enough to find a game that allows us to experience that level of presence, replayable or not, then such a game would truly offer something valuable.